I am Kirsten Harris-Talley, and I'm a Black queer PTA mom activist running for state representative in the 37th Legislative District for Position 2, which is an open seat.
And could you tell me a little bit about your district?
Yeah, so the 37th district is, I am a bit biased, the most amazing district in Washington state. It is the most diverse district in Washington state and was drawn so in 2010 when redistricting happened. It's a district that runs from North Renton through unincorporated Skyway, north through the Rainier Valley, the Central District, Chinatown International District, and it also has a carve-out in Pioneer Square that includes most of the urban native led organizations and work happening in our region as well. So truly a diverse district. The history of the district is a history of redlining, which is what's led to so much of that diversity. While it's regretful that a racist policy like redlining would create the diversity that's here, what's wonderful about the diversity here and what people built out of that kind of oppression is really wonderful. So we're a working class district. Black, brown, indigenous families make up a large part of the district. We have more renters than homeowners in the district. So issues of gentrification, affordability, who is getting opportunities, over-policing, climate justice is a huge issue. So I truly believe that if we can make the change that'll make my neighbors here in the 37th's lives better, we have an opportunity to make everyone in Washington state's lives better, which is why when my neighbors asked me to run, and after I talked it through with my family, I was honored to be able to say, yes, I'll give this a chance and see if we can make some change for our neighbors here while we're doing the work in Olympia.
And what kind of personal experience would you be bringing to this job?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. I had an unusual career path. Certainly running for office is not something I ever thought I would do in my life. I'm the oldest of four, and I grew up in rural Missouri. My mom raised us as a single mom, and we had a circle of strong women around us growing up. But growing up where I grew up in the Midwest, I grew up in a teeny town, Pop 300. Racism was very overt there. You were always put in your place, and there was a certain place that Black people were to be. So the messages certainly weren't that I was someone whose voice mattered. And I feel lucky that I had a family that I did, that the reinforcing message from my own family was that, well, your life does matter. And this is just one small moment in your life. And you're going to do greater things. And my father's Black, my mother's white, East Coast people. So an East Coast sensibility. And in the Midwest, folks, say it as it is. And so really grew up with that and had a lot of modeling of folks standing up for other people and showing up for each other. Growing up as poor as I did and everyone being poor, folks didn't have a lot, but what they had, they would give you. And I experienced that throughout my life and really always carried that ethos with me of service and helping others. I was partially raised by my godmother, Hazel May. She grew up as a child of sharecroppers and had to leave school at the age of 10 to work the fields herself. And I always remembered her experience. She didn't get her GED or learn to read till much later in life. She was in her 60s and 70s before that happened. I remember doing our homework together when she was studying for her GED. And that was a formidable experience for me as well, to know someone who had experienced the Great Depression, the Northern Migration, where Black people were trying to find freedom by heading north. Those lessons really stuck with me. And I was very lucky. When I first moved to Seattle in 1999, I worked for a .com. That was my first sort of professional job. And the dot bubble burst very quickly. And it was a Black woman who gave me an opportunity. I worked for an organization called Cardia. And early in my career, I got to work on the Healthy Youth Act and work in coalition with a coalition built in partnership with that organization and dozens of others around Washington state. We passed a sex ed bill that made sure science-based information was used for sexual health and healthy relationship information. And it really shaped my perspective of what it could be to be an activist and make systems change in policy. I've always approached my work from a frame of an activist, of standing shoulder to shoulder with my neighbors, the folks most impacted, and carried that through when I transitioned from that point in my career of doing that work, mostly in health and human services, all over Washington State and the region, to being political director at Progress Alliance of Washington. I started there as the program director and got to work on some of the most amazing initiatives and policy work we've seen in Washington State Voting Rights Act that makes sure that we have protections for Black, brown, and Indigenous folks running for office when we saw the gutting of the federal level Voting Rights Act. Voter rights expansion, the largest package for voter rights expansion in the U.S. when we passed that a couple years ago. Democracy vouchers on the city of Seattle level to make sure that dark dollars stay out of our democracy and the voice of the people is represented in how campaigns are financed. The Block the Bunker movement, which was work to make sure that we did not invest in more policing systems, but had questions about how community voice should be in those processes. No new youth jail, where we're still doing work to make sure youth aren't incarcerated. In 2017, I was appointed to Seattle City Council for 51 days when we had our mayoral transitions that year before the current mayor was voted in. Teresa Mosqueda took the seat with the transition when I left. And while I was there, I also got to work on the employee hours tax, which was sort of the preamble to the just passed Jumpstart for progressive revenue, looking at largest corporations to pay their share in to make sure that we can buy the things that folks need for basic survival. So I feel blessed. I've had a really unique path of finding that when I needed to learn something, someone taking me under their wing, helping me navigate what it is to stand with community. So I have a unique path to this, but one that I think has value now, particularly.
Well, it seems like you've had a long commitment to your city and community. What drives that?
I think the roots of where I come from, of what I described in growing up, a lot of it comes from that. I didn't really understand income inequity until I moved from my own community, because where I lived, we were all equally deeply impoverished. It was shocking. I got a partial scholarship to go to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and I was very excited to move to a big city. But it was shocking to see how stark the disparity was when I got to Chicago. And I was there also when Cabrini Green was happening. For folks who don't know, Cabrini Green is one of the most overt present day examples of government pushing out residents for gentrification. Cabrini Green had been a public project, social housing project from the mid-century in Chicago. There had been speculation on the land from the city of Chicago. And when residents wouldn't move, they sent in folks to forcibly move them. It was really egregious. It was a stark example, I think, of how government can misuse its power. And that was really formidable for me, starting to do some activism even then. So I think it's growing up and seeing the lived experience of seeing folks put upon, but also seeing folks stand up for each other that has really shaped my worldview. While I'm not from Seattle originally, my deep commitment and the way I view activism is definitely birthed here. So I think it's a lot of that. And it's interesting to me how much more deeply my commitment to the work was shaped when I became a mother. I have two young children. Our oldest will be in 4th grade in the fall, and our youngest will be starting kindergarten. And the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm very committed to Black Lives Matter movement. I myself am an abolitionist. I believe that there's a future where we can have a future without incarceration and policing used as control. I believe that we can end slavery. Our policing and prison system is an extension of the slavery system, because the 13th Amendment had a loophole that said slavery could continue and continue to exploit free labor in our prison systems. And having my children, I think, really cemented my drive to ending that system. I would love my children to not have to say Black Lives Matter, because they're simply experiencing every day that folks are caring for them as if their lives do. So a lot of things drive me, but mostly the reality that what I'm seeing in action in the streets now, what I see of folks paying attention, I really believe we can all collectively change the world. And I really believe in democracy and the voice of the people. So it's exciting to be in this moment running a campaign now when there's so much possibility ahead of us.
So right now, one of the biggest issues on people's mind is this pandemic, the COVID-19 stuff. What do you think the state should have done to handle this, and what do you think it should do going forward?
It's such a sobering thing to have a pandemic hit the way it hit and when it hit. I appreciate that we live in a state that immediately believed the science and had certain systems that could wrap care around our neighbors. Not every state is in that position. I say that because I still have family in rural Missouri, and hearing the base of the conditions there versus the base of conditions here in Washington does give us some advantages. I was glad to see that fairly quickly there was consideration of a moratorium. I wish we had forgiveness instead of moratorium, but to see that there was a recognition that folks, the basic needs of housing and food, that there was immediate action around those pieces. I also appreciated the thoughtfulness and the data-driven approach in which phases were introduced as a way to keep an eye on what transmission was looking like as we considered what it was to reopen and rebuild some of these institutions that we've all come to depend on to run our lives. And that said, COVID-19 has not brought anything new, I think, to what it is to really understand how far behind we are in addressing the needs for our neighbors. But what it has done is made every fault line really acute. And what's really clear is, having a piece together, still for-profit healthcare system, even with the Affordable Care Act, is leaving far too many of our neighbors behind. I think we really need to consider what it is to move to a single-payer healthcare model. The reason Medicare for All is exciting as a solution is because it's a single-payer, government interface system already that provides care for so many people. We also have models, of course, in VA and veteran supports and healthcare as well. But it's just really clear that that's the direction we're going to have to go. Uncoupling folks' insurance from their ability to work is also really clearly putting so many folks behind, as we've seen such a huge amount of folks lose their jobs so quickly. For unions like Unite Here 8, which is a hospitality-based union, to see 90% of their workforce laid off in less than a month, I think just shows how important it is for folks to have care beyond their ability to work, particularly when circumstances like this keep them from being able to work. But most acutely, what I'm aware of, and it's something I think about with having introduced the employee hours tax in 2017, if we had introduced that tax and passed it in 2017, the system of government and what it takes to build the system to then collect those taxes, bring them in, and then have that pool of money to spend would be in place right now. And it's not, because we did not pass that tax at that time. Washington State has the most upside down and regressive tax code in the entire country, which means where I grew up in rural Missouri has a better quality tax code that's more equitable. Every state you can imagine does. We have the worst, despite having the largest multinational corporations in the world in our backyard and having some of the healthiest margins of what achievable incomes are, which also brings us to having the deepest income disparities when you look at that, particularly across gender, race, and ethnicity. So what it is to turn our upside down tax code right side up is the most essential question we have to have at the state level. It's hard to see the governor bring forward a proposal of a budget that has a $7 billion with a B deficit that also had a consideration of furloughs for state employees, unionized employees. That's not something you want to see in a first wave budget, because if you're willing to say that you're willing to put employees' hours and time on the line, it means that the second and third waves of those things could lead to layoffs and more people losing jobs. And to see any erosion in good paying, good quality, stable jobs that have wraparound services for folks at the state level, I think is the wrong cue that we're sending to business at large in the state. I have deep concerns that we are not having far more robust conversations about really taking action about closing capital gains loopholes, making sure we have a working families tax credit to get dollars into our local neighbors' pockets to spend in the local businesses, the small businesses that are hanging on by a thread to still survive. We need those businesses to have healthy local economies, and we don't want to see them fail. The fact that we need to start talking about the fact that our tax code's dependent on property taxes and B&O taxes when folks are going to be staring down their ability to even pay their mortgages or rent, and what that's going to mean for our housing market, as well as small and medium-sized businesses that can't run, aren't bringing in revenue, and therefore can't pay taxes, is something that we're going to have to address. So for me, the core of all the justice that I want to see in the state will have to be implemented, and we're going to need a lot of money to take care of people. And it's about time that those who have more than the rest of us pay their share, because the rest of us who've already been hurting are hurting even worse now, and we don't have any more to give. And we need support to survive this and rebuild our systems to what they should be to take care of everyone. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm excited about the possibility of working with my neighbors in January to start making this right as quickly as possible.
Another major issue right now is, all the protests, all the police violence. How do you think the issues of racial justice and police brutality can be addressed at the state issue or state level? I'm sorry.
I am proud to be an activist in Black Lives Matter. The movement started in Ferguson, Missouri. Having grown up there, it's very understandable why the movement would start there. I grew up in a far more explicitly racist place than here. And I say more explicitly because it's certainly clear that it's racist here. It's just not with the same explicitness as other places in the country. At the local level, and throughout the state and throughout the movement, there are three coupled demands about what we need to do to start acting like Black Lives Matter and go beyond just saying it. The first is that we have to divest from systems of harm. And I know that that feels shocking to some folks who feel like this is all new and out of nowhere and hasn't been tracking that this is a fight that's literally been happening for centuries. When you think of the abolition movement first starting when folks were trying to free Black people from chattel slavery and enslavement. So that divestment question, we never seem to bat an eye when folks say at the state level, we're going to divest from public education, we're going to divest from job training, we're going to divest from healthcare, we're going to divest from building bridges and roads. Those divestments and cuts happen all day long and no one bats an eye. But the anxiety that comes with the question of, are you going to divest from police? Usually when I ask folks, their fear is that there will be no first responders coming, that when they make the call and need help, there won't be anyone there to answer the call. And the reason the three demands are all linked is because no one is asking for divestment in isolation. What they're asking for is divestment from systems of harm. And it's really clear to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people that great harm is being caused by the amount and ways in which investment in policing is happening. It's not right that Black people and Brown people and Indigenous people have to walk around and not feel safe and worried that the people they should be able to call and trust when they need help are not the people who will help them. And in fact, you might end up dead on the other side of it. We've just seen it too many times to not know that that's a possibility for all of us. So the investment on the other side of that, where do those dollars go? And what are the new systems of first responders who actually meet the needs of our communities is a core question. And then the third demand of, for those who are using their First Amendment right to protest publicly, to demand these things to get the justice that they want to see in the world, they should not be arrested. They should not be prosecuted. They should not then be put into the systems that they are literally trying to fight to reimagine a future of. So at the state level, when I think of those three demands and considerations, we need to talk about an audit of the Washington State Department of Corrections and whether or not the systems and the harms that are happening at that state level should be invested in. A lot of people don't know in Washington State that folks birthing while incarcerated literally wore shackles until about 10 years ago, a literal legacy of slavery. They don't know, right, that folks are put into isolation when they get ill. So the things that we know is seen as abuse and terrorism and torture devices, right? Just because you're ill means that you could be isolated from folks for 23 hours out of 24 hours in a day. Forced feeding happens, all sort of really egregious things that people aren't aware of. And we invest in those things with our tax dollars. We need to look at what it is to divest from bail. I don't think anyone should be sitting in jail just because they can't afford to get out of jail. And a bail system creates those kind of conditions for too many people who are waiting to have their day in court with their peers review. We have legal financial obligations after folks have already served their time, that we have limitations to them having access to any number of things: employment, housing, advanced education, so they can have access to employment or upward mobility, because they might still owe $100 to the state of Washington for something. And we, in fact, even keep people's right to vote away from them. And certainly in a mail-in state, I don't think it should be any question that just because your address might happen to be in a jail or prison, that you shouldn't still have the right to vote. And seeing places like Washington, D.C. talk about why are we taking citizens' rights away just because they happen to be incarcerated needs to be a question we want to ask here. It would shift a huge dynamic of who our voting base is in Washington state. So there's a lot we can do at the state level. But furthermore, we're going to have to think on the state level, what is investment in these new systems of caring? I am proud to have worked on Initiative 940, De-Escalate Washington, which was a number of families who had lost loved ones to police violence, taking their grief and turning it into action to remove the malice standard at the state level. The malice standard made it almost impossible to prove the malice in someone's heart as an officer when they killed someone in the streets. And gave no legal recourse for accountability or even review beyond internal police reviews, and had left so many families with unanswered questions about what had happened to their loved ones who were no longer in their lives. So to see laws like that and to be able to put time, energy into what de-escalation instead of deadly force training looks for folks who will stay in our police forces and sheriff's forces, so that we can actually have systems of care with any policing we will need to retain. Those are the kind of places where we should be concentrating as a state and investing. And we absolutely positively need to stand as a state and not allow continued prosecution and jailing of protesters. It was very disappointing to have our governor call for National Guard to stand behind police officers on Seattle city streets when protesters were using their constitutional rights. I would like to see those sorts of practices of militarized policing and expanded policing shift in the attitude about what it is to use your legal rights and your First Amendment rights to protest. And we have a lot we can do on the state level to protect protesters and their right to use their voice.
Do you have time for a couple more questions? I know we're kind of up on time now.
I do.
Okay. I was just kind of wondering, what other legislative priorities would you have?
Oh my goodness. Climate justice is huge for me. The 37th district has the worst air quality, some of the worst soil quality, and some of the worst water quality in the entire state. We're situated at our southern border by SeaTac Airport, and then to both the east and the west by two Boeing airfields, which contributes both to noise pollution and air pollution. The legacy of redlining means that so much of our community was built on fill and toxic industrial fill, which contributes to the soil quality. And of course, because of redlining and what industrialization looked like around all the areas on borders of our district, industrialization near waterways has contributed to really poor water quality. So enacting the HEAL Act, revisiting what it is to consider a carbon tax that is not revenue neutral, but is revenue positive, so we can invest in a Green New Deal and green infrastructure and green jobs across the state, is an exciting prospect for a state like ours that has deep respect for our natural resources and good union, good working family jobs as well. I'm really excited about following the lead of folks like Front and Centered, Got Green, Puget Sound Sage, and others who are leading the work with Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks, the most impacted in our communities, leading that work. And that is beyond a crisis point now. For me, that also intersects with housing justice, a huge issue for our district because of gentrification and what it is to have enough affordable housing infrastructure, make sure our houseless neighbors have access to housing and an upward option to move from temporary to permanent housing and wraparound services. but also keeping our elders who may own outright to be able to stay in their homes. Too often, the prospecting and other things happening with property is raising their property taxes beyond their ability to stay in homes and stay in the communities that they've built. And I would like to see a more centralized approach with density and other considerations so that folks can live close to the center of their lives. That's really important as we consider what the possibilities of the future of our region could look like.
You briefly mentioned about sex ed, and that's been kind of like a big concern amongst the Republicans I've been interviewing. And there's a lot of skepticism about the value of it. Would you mind telling us why sex ed is important?
Absolutely. For me, it really feels full circle in many ways. As I mentioned earlier, the first policy I ever got to advocate for was the Healthy Youth Act. And now, as the executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice Washington, we, amongst a coalition of partners, have all just passed a mandatory comprehensive version that actually expands that every school will have local control and get to choose their curricula and have voice in the curricula, but that there will be a requirement that all students have access to that science-based information. For me, the core issue and question at the core of this, and I say this as someone who's written some of this curricula. I have literally trained thousands of practitioners across the state, the region, and the country on this curricula, and I know what this curricula looks like. And it's really basic information, understanding and knowing the parts of your body, how to talk to someone if you're experiencing abuse or feel uncomfortable, how to know how to talk to medical providers, the language and context of language you would need to do reporting or considerations of conversations, wrap around and support for LGBTQ youth to understand their experience and resources, pieces around consent so that we can have shifts in rape culture and prevent, hopefully, folks being in coercive relationships, and also what it is to be in abusive relationships, how to recognize those sorts of abuses, how to seek help, and have, again, a way to communicate it so folks can wrap health and care around you. These are essential things. The other piece, of course, is that there are considerations with all of it of accommodations around equity and education so that you can have age-appropriate conversations about these things at every level, right? So you wouldn't be having conversations, for instance, around safety and birth control use with a kindergartner. Those are not age-appropriate conversations for a kindergartner. But the kind of conversations you would have with a kindergartner to start having conversations about consent is, we don't hit or touch people's bodies without asking permission. That's an age-appropriate way to start the concept of consent, right, in a way that kindergartners can wrap their mind around, and also start practicing the behaviors that when you start having the conversation about what that looks like in a relationship context for a teenager, you have the building blocks of what consent is as you're having anti-rape culture conversations later down the road. So I've seen the reality and experienced the reality of how transformative that education is. When I was coming up with considerations of the vote, for folks who didn't keep track of this issue, it was a really unique vote this last ledge session. It literally happened at 2 a.m. Because the Republicans had introduced wholly almost 200 amendments, and they were really some quite egregious amendments. Things like we should be doing prayers in school. There's a separation of church and state for a reason. That we should be showing all children of all ages films of abortions in progress. Nothing like that should ever be in education. And it was shocking to see Republicans suggesting such things. The most egregious and harmful things I've actually seen spoken about sex ed has been in these speculative spaces of folks introducing sort of fear-mongering about these things. And that's just not been my lived experience in doing the work at all. At the core of why I think many Republicans may be scared is because what they're saying is that they're going to have less control over what their child learns, when the law is quite the opposite. It's giving far more prescription and guidelines about local control and input, just like any other curricula in our public schools and institutions. And as with all curricula, anyone with religious right or exemptions can go through processes at their public school to get what they need to accommodate to accommodate the values and needs of their family. So there really isn't anything to be afraid of. As much control as you have over understanding what's happening in public education with any curriculum access in your public schools, that will continue for this curricula as well. And I'm someone, right, who always says, I would never want my child not to be able to communicate with any trusted adult, care if that something happened to them and they needed help. And so much of what this education is about them having the vocabulary and voice to ask for help when they need it and articulate their needs so that they can have healthy relationships. And I'm hard pressed to think that any parent or community member doesn't want that for the children in our lives.
Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners about why they should be giving you their vote?
I will say this is a really unique year in Washington State. I am one of 9 Black women running simultaneously across Washington State. That's never happened before. Black women have been on the front lines of work and serving community need for a long time, and quite frankly have done it thanklessly and without recognition. And it's exciting to think that that could change in Washington State. We have a really unique opportunity right now in the 37th for the first time to send a Black woman to represent us. And I do think the intersection of my identity, but more importantly, the fact that I have shown myself over all these years to have done the work already. I know the players in Olympia. I know the game. I know how caucus and committee work works. I understand the stakes and what these processes look like. And when I served on Seattle City Council in those 51 days, folks came out later asking, how did you do so much in such a short amount of time? And it's because I really did know what I was doing when I got there, but more importantly, because I built coalition around me immediately, and I worked with every colleague there. Even when we didn't agree on everything, we could find the things that had common ground, and we worked on those things together to make people's lives better. And I really believe that's how the work happens. So I would be honored. I am honored already by how many neighbors have come forward. You know, we're the only endorsed Democrat in the race. We have over 150 individual neighbors who've personally endorsed. We have folks like Larry Gossett, right, who's a legacy as a King County Council member and founder of our local Black Panther Party, and folks like Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal saying, yes, the way you're building this community campaign is the way we think leadership should look as we rebuild from this historic moment. So I just want to work with people and make good things happen for our neighbors. And I hope my neighbors see fit to give me that opportunity.
And if people want to learn more about you and your campaign, where should they go?
We would love folks to join what we're building. There's tons of ways to plug in from the safety of your home. And you can check out everything we're doing at Elect KHT, which are my initials for Kirsten Harris-Talley, electkht.org. You can also find us at ElectKHT on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and they also have me dancing up on TikTok if you want to have a little bit of fun. So we're really trying to build something new. We're keeping folks most impacted close, and my goal is to make sure you aren't left out of the conversation in Olympia, but have your voice amplified. That's the goal.
Make sure I have all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for all you're doing to make sure neighbors get to hear about candidates. It makes a difference. Have a great day.
You've been listening to Talk to Seattle, and I've been your host, Jason Rigdon. If you liked this episode, would you please share it on social media? Most podcast clients have a little share button. Click that and tell people why they should listen. If you want to support Talk to Seattle, would you please give the show a rating and review on iTunes? It really helps new people discover the show, and it makes me happy. Follow Talk to Seattle on Twitter at Talk to Seattle, and email any questions, comments, or suggestions to jasonrigdon@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening.